before images were instant, before memory lived in clouds and servers, before every moment could be captured, edited, and shared in seconds. Reality had a physical form. If something mattered, if it needed to be remembered, if it had to be proven, it had to exist on film, not as data. Not as a file, but as an object. Light passed through a lens, struck a surface, left a permanent mark, and that mark became evidence. For most of the 20th century, this is how the world decided what was real, not by what could be said, not by what could be written, but by what could be seen. And more importantly, what could be developed, printed, and archived. Film was not simply a way to take pictures. It was a system, a method for turning moments into records, for transforming events into proof, for giving history a physical body. A photograph was not just an image. It was a thing you could hold, store, file, authenticate. It could be examined, verified, compared. If it existed on film, it existed in the world. This was the language of truth. Newspapers trusted it. Courts relied on it. Governments archived it. Families built their memories around it. Wars were understood through it. Crimes were proven by it. Identities were defined with it. Before digital, before databases, before infinite storage, film was how reality was kept. Not because it was perfect, but because it was tangible. You could lose it, you could damage it, you could destroy it, but you could never mistake it for something that wasn't real. A negative was not an idea. It was a physical trace of light that once touched the world, and for an entire century that was enough. That was how events became history, how moments became evidence, how memory became permanent. This was not about cameras. This was about how civilization decided what counted as truth. When the world ran on film. Before film, reality could be described, but it could not be preserved. Events were recorded in words, in handwritten accounts, in official reports, in testimony. History existed as narrative. What happened was what someone said happened. What could be proven was what could be written down. What could be remembered was what survived in language. But language is fragile. Descriptions change. Accounts conflict. Memories fade. Documents can be altered, copied, or lost. Two people could witness the same event and record two different versions of reality. Truth depended on trust, and trust depended on authority. If something occurred in public, it was debated. If it occurred in private, it was often unverifiable. If it happened once and left no physical trace, it could be denied. This was not a flaw in society. It was a structural limitation of how information moved. Reality existed in time, but proof did not. An event could be experienced, but not examined later, not compared. not re-evaluated. Once the moment passed, what remained was interpretation, and interpretation is not evidence. This limitation shaped everything. Crimes relied on testimony. Journalism relied on witnesses. Governments relied on reports. History relied on consensus. Not because people were dishonest, but because there was no permanent visual record. A battle could be described, but not seen. A disaster could be reported, but not verified. An identity could be written down, but not fixed in form. Even when images existed, drawings, engravings, paintings, they were interpretations. They reflected the hand of the artist, the perspective of the observer, the intention of the institution. They were representations of events, not traces of them. What the world lacked was not documentation. It lacked evidence, something that did not rely on memory, did not depend on narrative, did not require belief. Before film, reality could be argued, it could be recorded, but it could not be independently verified. And in a world growing larger, faster, more complex, that limitation would become impossible to ignore. Film did not arrive as entertainment. It arrived as infrastructure. For the first time, reality could be captured without interpretation. Light itself became the witness. When an image was recorded on film, it was not a description of an event. It was a physical trace of the event. Not someone's memory, not someone's account, but the imprint of light that had actually touched the world. This changed everything. An event could now be examined after it had passed, not imagined, not reconstructed, but observed. Moments could be preserved exactly as they occurred. Not filtered through language, not reshaped by authority. For the first time, proof no longer depended on who spoke. It depended on what had been recorded. Film did not make reality permanent, but it made reality inspectable. A photograph could be studied, compared, enlarged, archived. Two people could look at the same image and see the same evidence. Disagreement was no longer about what had happened. It became about what the image showed, and that distinction reshaped institutions. Journalism changed. News was no longer only reported. It was shown. What once relied on testimony now relied on images. A photograph from the scene was not an opinion. It was a record. Law changed. Evidence was no longer confined to written statements and witnesses. Film could document crime scenes, capture identities, fix events in time. A moment could be returned to, re-examined, verified. Governments changed. Records were no longer just text. They became visual archives, passports, identification, surveillance, documentation of the state itself. Film did not simply add images to the world. It introduced a new standard of truth, something that could be preserved without translation, reproduced without alteration, stored without reinterpretation. For the first time in history, an event could exist beyond the moment it occurred, not as a story, but as evidence. And once that threshold was crossed, there was no return. Reality had acquired a physical record, not in memory, not in testimony, but in light, fixed to material. Film did not change what happened. It changed what could be proven. Once film had proven itself as evidence, it did not remain exceptional. It became ordinary, not celebrated, not questioned, simply assumed. Reality was now something that could be recorded, and once that expectation took hold, the world reorganized around it. Journalism no longer relied on description. Events were not only reported, they were shown. A photograph in a newspaper did more than illustrate a story. It authenticated it. What appeared on film became what the public believed had happened. News without images felt incomplete. Claims without photographs felt uncertain. Seeing replaced hearing. Law followed the same path. Courtrooms filled with photographs. Crime scenes were documented. Evidence was preserved visually. Moments were no longer confined to testimony. They could be revisited, examined again, compared across time, placed before judges and juries. Truth became something that could be displayed. Government systems adapted as well. Identity was no longer just written. It was pictured. Passports carried faces. Identification required images. Records became visual archives of the state. A person was no longer only a name in a ledger. They were a photograph in a file. Even memory itself was transformed. Families documented their lives on film. Birthdays, weddings, vacations, funerals. What had once been remembered in stories was now preserved in images. Albums replaced recollection. Photographs replaced narration. If a moment was not captured, it felt incomplete. If it was not on film, it felt as though it might disappear. Film became the silent witness of everyday life. But nowhere was its authority more visible than in conflict. Wars were no longer only described. They were seen. Battlefields, refugees, destruction. Images carried reality across borders. What once required belief now demanded response. A single photograph could define public understanding of an event. Not because it explained, but because it proved that something had occurred. This was the golden era of film, not as art, not as nostalgia, but as infrastructure. A system so embedded in daily life that it became invisible. No one asked whether a photograph was real. They asked only what it showed. Reality, for the first time, had a default form. It was visual, it was physical, and it was preserved. This was not a change in technology. It was a change in how civilization remembered itself. The end of film did not arrive as a crisis. There was no final role. no moment when the world stopped using it, because film was not defeated. It was replaced by something that changed the nature of reality itself. At first, digital images were not taken seriously. Early sensors were crude, resolution was low, colors were inaccurate, details were lost. A digital image could be copied endlessly, but it could not yet be trusted. It felt temporary, easily altered. Detached from the physical world, film still carried authority. A negative could be examined. A print could be archived. A photograph had weight. But digital did not try to compete on film's terms. It changed the terms. The image was no longer an object. It became information. Once an image could be stored as data, it no longer depended on chemistry, paper, or physical archives. It could be duplicated without degradation, transferred instantly across distance, stored in quantities no archive could contain. The photograph no longer needed a place to exist. It could exist everywhere. At first, institutions resisted. Journalists questioned authenticity. Courts questioned admissibility. Governments questioned permanence. If an image could be edited, if it could be altered without leaving a physical trace, how could it still be evidence? But quietly, the tools improved. Resolution increased. Sensors became precise. Compression preserved detail. Metadata recorded time, location, and origin. What had once seemed fragile became exact. Digital images did not just match film, they surpassed it. Not by being more real, but by being more functional. A digital image could be searched, sorted, indexed, analyzed by machines. It could be compared across databases, verified against records. Stored without physical decay, the archive was no longer a room. It was a system. And once that system was in place, film was no longer necessary for evidence. Not in journalism, not in law, not in government, not in daily life. Images no longer needed to be printed to be real. They only needed to exist in the network. What had once required chemicals, darkrooms, and storage vaults, now required only data. Film did not suddenly disappear. It remained in art, in archives, in specialized disciplines. But outside those spaces, the world had already crossed a threshold. Reality no longer needed a physical surface. It could exist as information. And once that shift occurred, the system built on physical images became optional, not obsolete by failure, but by irrelevance. Film did not disappear. It withdrew. As digital images became the default, film lost its role as the foundation of evidence. Not because it failed, but because the world no longer required what it provided. The physical trace of light, the tangible proof, the object you could hold. Truth no longer needed weight. In a digital world, an image does not exist as a thing. It exists as information. It can be copied infinitely, edited invisibly, stored everywhere and nowhere at once. Reality became fluid, not anchored to material, not limited by decay, not bound to a single original. This brought extraordinary power. Images could travel instantly. Archives could expand without limit. Moments could be preserved without fear of loss. The memory of the world became searchable, indexable, accessible. But something subtle changed. When images no longer carried physical cost, they lost physical consequence. A photograph once required intention, materials, time. Now it requires only a device and a moment. Images multiplied, and as they multiplied, their authority diluted. In the age of film, a photograph demanded attention. It was rare, deliberate, fixed. In the digital age, images are constant, endless, disposable, replaceable. The question shifted. It was no longer, did this happen? It became, which version do we trust? Because when truth becomes data, it becomes editable. A negative could be examined. A print could be authenticated. But a file can be altered without leaving a trace. Reality did not become false. It became negotiable. Film once acted as friction, a barrier that slowed interpretation, that demanded care, that imposed limits. Digital removed that friction, and with it, certainty became conditional. This does not mean the world is worse. It means it is different. We gained speed, scale, access, but we lost weight. Truth no longer rests in objects. It rests in systems. Metadata, verification protocols, trust frameworks. Reality is now something we agree upon, not something we hold. Film still exists. In archives, in museums, in the hands of artists who value its resistance. Not because it is superior, but because it reminds us that truth once had mass, that evidence once aged, could be damaged, could be lost, and that vulnerability was part of its authority. Film was not just a technology, it was a constraint, and constraints shape meaning. When reality had weight, it demanded responsibility. When it became data, it demanded governance. This is the legacy of film. Not nostalgia, not aesthetics, but a reminder that how we store truth changes how we treat it. And once truth loses its physical form, the question is no longer how we capture reality. It is how we choose to believe it.